The handcuffs clicked shut around my 72-year-old father's wrists as our entire neighborhood watched in horror. My dad, Walter Blackwood, Purple Heart recipient, 30-year FBI veteran, was being arrested on his own front lawn over a $50 HOA fine. A fine that was completely bogus, by the way. And there she was, Karen Whitmore, our neighborhood's self-appointed dictator, standing in her pristine doorway like she'd just won the lottery. That smug smile plastered across her face as 3 police cars lit up our quiet Tuesday morning. The smell of fresh-cut grass mixed with the acrid stench of injustice as neighbors emerged from their houses, phones already recording. But Karen made one tiny miscalculation. She had no idea she just declared war on a family where everyone carries federal badges. My name's Devin Blackwood, DEA Supervisory Agent. And what happened next? Let's just say Karen's about to learn why you never mess with federal law enforcement families. What would you do if your HOA president called cops on your veteran father over a bogus fine? Where are you watching from? Drop your HOA nightmare in the comments. Let me back up and tell you how this nightmare started. Because Karen Whitmore didn't just randomly decide to destroy my family. This was a calculated campaign that began the moment she moved into Willowbrook Estates 18 months ago. I'm Devin Blackwood, 42, DEA Supervisory Agent. After my divorce last year, I moved back to my hometown where my father Walter lives in the guest house behind my place. Walter's 72, retired FBI Purple Heart recipient. Every morning at 5:30 sharp, you can hear him doing 100 push-ups through the thin walls. The rhythmic counting echoes across the yard, followed by the whistle of his ancient coffee kettle that's been brewing coffee since the Carter administration. My sister Maya works IRS criminal investigation down in Atlanta. My brother Cole's a U.S. Marshal stationed 2 states over. Growing up in a law enforcement family teaches you one thing early. Always document everything, because the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. Willowbrook Estates isn't fancy. Built in the 80s, middle-class subdivision where kids still ride bikes in the street and Mrs. Bennett grows tomatoes the size of softballs. On weekends, the air hangs thick with barbecue smoke and the distant hum of lawnmowers. In spring, you can smell fresh mulch mixed with the sweet scent of blooming dogwoods and hear the crack of baseball bats from the park down the street. Sidewalks are cracked in places. Some driveways desperately need repaving, but it's home. It's real. Then Karen Whitmore showed up like a tornado in designer heels. 55 years old, real estate agent, who moved here from some expensive suburb where apparently people aren't allowed to have vegetable gardens or park pickup trucks that show honest wear. Karen took one look at our neighborhood and saw dollar signs. Not community, opportunity. Within 6 months, she'd manufactured enough drama to get herself elected HOA president at a meeting where only 12 people showed up. Most folks didn't even know we needed an HOA. And from my years investigating organized crime, I know that's exactly how these schemes start. Low attendance means easy control. We need to protect property values, she announced at that first meeting, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been told no. Certain standards must be maintained if we want this neighborhood to thrive. Her first target? Walter's vegetable garden. 20 neat rows of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs that he tends every morning after his push-ups. The smell of rich soil and growing vegetables apparently offended Karen's suburban sensibilities like a personal insult. This isn't agricultural zoning, she told Walter during their first confrontation, standing at our fence line in her pristine white heels that had clearly never touched actual dirt. That garden is unsightly and inappropriate for a residential neighborhood. Walter, being the methodical investigator he trained to be for 30 years, spent 3 straight days researching county codes, found absolutely nothing prohibiting vegetable gardens. In fact, the county actually encourages them for sustainability. So he did what any rational person would do. Ignored her completely. That was his first mistake. Tuesday morning, Walter parked his 1995 Ford pickup on the street while contractors repaired our driveway. The truck's got character, faded blue paint, small dent in the tailgate from years of helping neighbors move furniture. But it runs like a dream, passes every inspection, and has never been classified as anything but a personal vehicle. Thursday morning, Walter found a bright orange citation tucked under his windshield wiper. The paper fluttered in the morning breeze as he unfolded it, the ink still smelling fresh from whatever printer Karen had used. Unauthorized commercial vehicle. Fine, $50. Karen's logic? The dent somehow made it look commercial. Walter walked that citation over to my kitchen table, his weathered hands still steady despite 7 decades of living. The rich aroma of his black coffee filled the room as he spread the paper flat, studying it like evidence in a federal case. "Devin, honey, you ever seen anything this ridiculous in your federal cases?" I had to laugh while scanning the bogus citation. "Dad, I've arrested cartel members for less creative legal theories than this." But Walter, ever the professional, spent the next 3 days researching municipal codes, HOA regulations, and state vehicle laws. Found zero basis for the citation. Nothing. Nada. So he did what any logical person would do, tossed it in the trash. That's when Karen declared war on social media. Karen's next move came exactly 1 week after Walter ignored her bogus citation, and it was a masterclass in petty tyranny disguised as community leadership. She called an emergency HOA meeting about escalating compliance issues, scheduling it for 2 p.m. on a Tuesday when most working people couldn't attend. The notice appeared on our doors Monday night, expensive card stock with professional printing that probably cost more than Walter's truck registration. Only Karen's closest allies showed up. 3 recent transplants from her old neighborhood who nodded along to everything she said like bobblehead dolls. In exactly 15 minutes, they passed a new rule that made my federal prosecutor instinct scream fraud. All unpaid fines would double every 30 days. Walter's $50 citation became a $100 penalty, retroactive immediately. From my years investigating organized crime, I knew this tactic: create artificial urgency to pressure victims into paying illegitimate demands before they can mount a legal challenge. But Karen made her first real mistake that day. She was so confident in her little power play that she actually recorded the meeting on her phone, posting highlights to the neighborhood Facebook group. "Democracy in action," she captioned it, apparently unaware that she'd just created evidence of conspiracy to commit extortion. I spent my lunch break that day doing what I do best, following the money trail. Using the state's business registration database, something every citizen can access but most people don't know exists, I discovered Karen's dirty secret. She'd never filed the proper nonprofit incorporation paperwork required for HOA operations. Technically, she was running an illegal collection scheme with no legal authority whatsoever. The smell of burnt coffee filled my office as I printed out page after page of state requirements. Any organization collecting fees from residents must register as either a nonprofit corporation or a business entity. Karen had done neither. In federal court, we call this operating under color of authority, and it carries serious criminal penalties. I made an anonymous tip to the county clerk's office that afternoon. Nothing traceable, just a concerned citizen asking them to verify the HOA's legal status. Sometimes the best investigations start with bureaucrats doing their jobs properly. Karen received that official notice 3 days later, and her panic was immediate and obvious. She started making frantic phone calls from her driveway, pacing back and forth in her designer heels while gesturing wildly. The clicking of those heels on concrete echoed across the quiet street like a nervous metronome. Her response proved she knew exactly how vulnerable her position was. Instead of addressing the legal issues, Karen doubled down on harassment. She had professional flyers printed, again expensive paper stock that suggested this wasn't her first rodeo, and distributed them strategically throughout the neighborhood. "Concerned about declining property values?" the headline screamed in bold red letters. "When certain residents disregard community standards, your investment suffers. Don't let a few bad actors destroy what we've built together." The flyers appeared only on cars belonging to longtime residents, skipping the newer BMWs and Audis entirely. I watched from my kitchen window as Karen placed them with surgical precision, and the pattern told me everything I needed to know about her real agenda. That evening brought the revelation that changed everything. Maya called with information that made my hands shake as I gripped the phone. She'd been running financial background checks, not official IRS business, just protective sister instincts using publicly available records. "Devin, you won't believe this," Maya's voice crackled through the speaker. "Karen's been depositing HOA fees into a personal checking account, $30,000 last year alone, and she's never reported a penny as income. That's not just HOA fraud, that's federal tax evasion." The pieces clicked together like evidence in a major financial crimes case. This wasn't neighborhood drama, this was an organized scheme to steal money under the pretense of community management. And unreported income over $10,000 triggers automatic federal jurisdiction, meaning Karen had just escalated herself into my professional territory. But the real bombshell came when I started talking to other neighbors. 3 longtime residents approached me separately at Morrison's grocery that weekend, each clutching their own orange citations like evidence in a war crimes trial. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they whispered their stories in the cereal aisle. Mrs. Patterson's hands trembled as she showed me her $200 fine for unauthorized lawn decorations. The violation? Her 4-year-old granddaughter's sidewalk chalk masterpiece of rainbow flowers. Mr. Williams received a citation for improperly displayed American flag. Apparently mounting Old Glory on a pole instead of the house violated Karen's aesthetic vision. Most heartbreaking was Mrs. Bennett, who pulled out a crumpled citation with tears in her eyes. $200 for weeds, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the frozen food cases. But they're not weeds, Devin. It's my butterfly garden. I planted it for my late husband. He loved watching monarchs migrate through our yard. The sweet scent of fresh-baked bread from the deli couldn't mask the bitter taste of injustice filling my mouth. Karen wasn't randomly harassing people. She was systematically targeting the most vulnerable residents with surgical precision. That night, Karen made her biggest mistake yet. She left an unsigned note under my door, but I recognized her precise handwriting from every HOA notice she'd posted. Tell your father that compliance isn't optional. Some people need to learn respect the hard way. Threatening a federal agent's family officially made this my case. Karen's desperation became obvious when she escalated to government authorities, filing a formal complaint with city code enforcement about Walter's truck. But this wasn't just petty harassment anymore. This was Karen testing how far her influence reached into local government, and what I discovered made my blood run cold. The complaint form was a masterpiece of creative fiction. Karen claimed Walter's truck leaked oil onto public streets and displayed unauthorized business signage, both complete lies. She was counting on bureaucratic rubber stamping, hoping the code officer would issue violations without investigating. What she didn't expect was getting Tom Rodriguez assigned to the case. Tom had known Walter for 30 years, served with him on the volunteer fire department back in the 90s. When Tom showed up Tuesday morning with his clipboard, the embarrassment was written all over his weathered face. The morning air hung thick with dew and the distant sweetness of Mrs. Bennett's jasmine blooming along her fence as he reluctantly began his inspection. "Walter, I gotta check out your truck," Tom called out, his voice carrying the tone of a man forced to investigate his friend over obvious nonsense. "Got a complaint says it's leaking oil and has business signs." Walter emerged from his garden, soil clinging to his hands from tending tomatoes. "Business signs? Tom, you've known this truck since Bush Sr. was president." "What business signs?" 7 minutes. That's all it took for Tom to document the complete absence of any violations. No oil stains, no business signage, no safety hazards whatsoever. His report later noted that the complainant had filed a report containing multiple false statements. Bureaucratic speak for, "This woman is a liar." But here's where Karen revealed the true scope of her corruption. She actually called Tom's supervisor, demanding he issue violations anyway, despite the clean inspection. During that recorded phone call, she said something that made my federal prosecutor instincts scream. "If your department won't cooperate with community standards, I'll have to discuss this matter with Judge Whitmore." Judge Whitmore, Karen's ex-husband. That afternoon, I did what any DEA agent does when following money trails. I pulled Karen's complete background: real estate license history, court records, business partnerships. What emerged was a pattern that federal prosecutors dream about: systematic fraud with a judicial connection. Karen had 2 previous ethics violations for undisclosed dual representation, where agents illegally represent both buyer and seller without disclosure. But the smoking gun was her current investigation by the State Real Estate Board for the exact same violation. Real estate agents who hide conflicts of interest usually have much bigger schemes running underneath, and Karen was no exception. The revelation that changed everything came from my brother Cole, calling from his U.S. Marshal post in Arizona. "Devin, that HOA situation you mentioned, I just closed a case here that's identical. Real estate agent, fake violations, shell company purchases, same exact pattern." Using federal databases that cross-reference interstate business patterns, we discovered Karen's true operation. She'd run this scheme in 3 previous neighborhoods over 5 years, systematically targeting vulnerable residents: elderly, minorities, working-class families, anyone who couldn't afford prolonged legal battles. Her method was surgical: create manufactured HOA violations, apply financial pressure through escalating fines, then have her shell company swoop in with below-market offers to help families escape their HOA troubles. It was organized real estate fraud disguised as community improvement, but Karen's desperation made her sloppy. Within 48 hours of Tom's clean inspection report, 5 families received simultaneous citations with 72-hour payment demands. Mrs. Bennett got $75 for mailbox nonconformity. Her mailbox was allegedly 2 inches too far from the curb. Jessica Martinez, a single mother, faced a $100 fine because her son's soccer ball was visible from the street. Mr. Patterson's Vietnam veteran license plate became improperly displayed commercial signage. The citations were printed on expensive paper with a slight vanilla scent from high-end laser printing, all formatted identically, clearly mass-produced from the same template. This wasn't random harassment. This was an industrial operation. Saturday morning at Henderson's hardware store, Karen made the mistake that gave us federal jurisdiction. She cornered Walter in the fertilizer aisle, where the air hung heavy with the earthy smell of potting soil and the metallic tang of garden tools. "Your family thinks federal badges make you special," she hissed, loud enough for a dozen customers to hear. "But I have connections too. This neighborhood doesn't need your kind of people." Walter, ever the professional, calmly activated his phone recorder. "What kind of people would that be, ma'am?" Karen's mask slipped completely. "Old-timers who think they can live in the past forever. People who don't understand that property values require certain standards. Maybe it's time you found somewhere more suitable for your lifestyle." The store manager and 3 customers witnessed her threat, but the real bombshell came when she added, "My ex-husband has been a judge for 15 years. He knows how to handle problem residents who won't cooperate with legitimate community standards." That single sentence gave us everything we needed: judicial corruption, interstate fraud conspiracy, and civil rights violations under color of authority. Karen had just confessed to running a criminal enterprise with a sitting judge as her partner. But the most shocking discovery came that evening when I ran a financial trace on Judge Whitmore's assets. He wasn't just Karen's ex-husband. He was a silent partner in her shell company, personally profiting from every property she fraudulently acquired. We weren't fighting a corrupt HOA president. We were facing a criminal conspiracy that reached into the courthouse itself. Karen's nuclear option came exactly 2 weeks later, and it was so audacious that even my years investigating cartel operations hadn't prepared me for this level of calculated malice. At 8:15 a.m. on a Tuesday, she filed a false police report claiming Walter had threatened her with violence. Not just any threat, she specifically alleged domestic violence, knowing that police departments must investigate these claims immediately regardless of how implausible they seem. Her story was masterfully crafted fiction. Walter had cornered her in Morrison's parking lot, made threatening gestures, and warned he'd make her sorry for messing with his family. The brilliance of her lie was terrifying. Karen understood that domestic violence protocols require immediate arrest and investigation, regardless of the suspect's age, military service, or community standing. She was weaponizing the system's protective mechanisms to publicly destroy my father's reputation. 3 patrol cars arrived at our house at 10:30 a.m., their red and blue lights strobing across our peaceful street like some dystopian light show. The sound of car doors slamming echoed between houses as neighbors emerged from their morning routines, phones already recording what appeared to be a major police operation. The air hung thick with the scent of blooming azaleas and fresh-cut grass, a perfect suburban morning about to be shattered by Karen's manufactured crisis. Walter was kneeling in his garden, hands deep in rich soil as he tended his tomato plants, completely unaware that his peaceful morning was about to become a public nightmare. Officer Martinez, ironically Jessica's brother-in-law from the neighborhood, approached with visible reluctance written across his face. "Mr. Blackwood, we need to discuss an incident at Morrison's grocery yesterday," Martinez said, his voice carrying the flat professionalism of a man who didn't believe what he was investigating but had to follow protocol anyway. Walter looked up with genuine confusion, soil still clinging to his weathered hands. "What incident? I wasn't at Morrison's yesterday. Spent the whole day right here in the garden." "Ma'am says you approached her aggressively in the parking lot, made threatening gestures and verbal threats about making her pay." The words sounded ridiculous coming out of Martinez's mouth, but domestic violence protocols don't care about ridiculousness. Across the street, Karen stood in her doorway like a queen surveying her kingdom, arms crossed and wearing that insufferable smug smile that had become her signature expression. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks and porches, phones capturing every moment as a Purple Heart recipient prepared to be handcuffed over a complete fabrication. The metallic click of handcuffs closing around Walter's wrists echoed across our quiet street with the finality of injustice served cold. Mrs. Bennett's audible gasp from her porch mixed with Mr. Patterson's disgusted headshake and the low murmur of neighbors who'd known Walter for decades watching him treated like a common criminal. But Walter handled the humiliation with 30 years of professional training, offering no resistance, no angry protests, just quiet dignity that made Karen's lies look even more absurd. "Officer, I was never at Morrison's yesterday. Mrs. Bennett and I discussed her butterfly garden around noon. She can verify I never left my yard." The smell of Karen's expensive perfume drifted across the street on the morning breeze, mixing sickeningly with the honest scent of garden soil on Walter's hands. Everything about this moment crystallized the contrast between her manufactured authority and his authentic service to community and country. 20 minutes later, Walter was released without charges. No evidence, no witnesses, no credible basis for Karen's allegations. But her real goal had been achieved. My father's public humiliation, captured on multiple phones and already spreading through neighborhood social media. I arrived just as they removed the handcuffs, watching Walter rub circulation back into wrists that had never been bound by anything except his wedding ring and military watch. The sight of this man who'd served his country with honor for 3 decades being treated like a criminal over Karen's calculated lies made something cold and lethal settle in my chest. I provided the officers with Walter's military records and character references, speaking calmly while my federal training kept my rage in check. But I didn't reveal my own law enforcement connections. Not yet. I was saving that revelation for maximum impact on Karen's carefully constructed house of lies. That evening brought intelligence that transformed our defensive position into an offensive strategy. Maya's voice over the phone made my coffee freeze halfway to my lips. "Devin, the IRS audit has uncovered something that changes everything. Karen's not just running a local scam, this is a massive interstate operation." When the numbers she recited made federal prosecutors salivate. 127,000 in unreported income, multiple shell companies across 4 states, electronic transfer of fraudulent fees across state lines. Every fake citation delivered through the Postal Service constituted mail fraud, and every electronic transaction triggered wire fraud jurisdiction. But the revelation that made my hands shake came from my brother Cole. "Devin, Karen's targeting isn't random. FBI analysis shows systematic demographic selection. Elderly, minorities, working-class families. This isn't just fraud, this is organized housing discrimination using HOA authority as cover, civil rights violations under color of authority, federal hate crime statutes, RICO conspiracy charges. Karen had just escalated from neighborhood bully to domestic terrorist, and she had no idea that 3 federal agents were building a case that would destroy not just her freedom, but her entire criminal network. The handcuffs on Walter's wrists were temporary. The ones waiting for Karen would be permanent. The breakthrough that changed everything came from the most boring source imaginable, insurance paperwork that I almost threw away without reading. 3 days after watching my father get handcuffed in our driveway, I was drowning in legal documents, trying to find any weapon we could use against Karen's systematic terrorism. Coffee stains marked half the papers spread across my kitchen table, and the smell of frustration hung in the air like burnt toast. That's when I found it buried in page 47 of the HOA's insurance policy, a clause that made my hands tremble with possibility. The insurance company required specific procedures for legitimate HOA fines, due process hearings, written appeals, documented notifications. Karen had violated every single requirement on every citation she'd ever issued. Her fraudulent fee collection had completely voided the insurance policy, leaving her personally liable for all damages without any protection whatsoever. But that discovery was nothing compared to what Maya found when she dug deeper into Westbrook Investment LLC, the mysterious company making lowball offers to harassed families. Corporate records revealed the ugly truth that made my stomach drop. Same registered address as Karen's real estate office, with her ex-husband Judge Whitmore listed as silent partner. The pieces clicked together like rounds loading into a magazine. This wasn't just neighborhood harassment. It was an organized criminal conspiracy reaching into the courthouse itself. Judge Whitmore had been rubber-stamping Karen's fake violation orders while financially benefiting from the properties she stole through manufactured HOA pressure. My sister's financial investigation uncovered the smoking gun buried in 3 years of bank records, $127,000 in unreported income from identical schemes across multiple states. Every electronic transfer of stolen HOA fees across state lines triggered federal wire fraud jurisdiction. Every fake citation delivered through Postal Service constituted mail fraud. Karen had been committing federal crimes so routinely she'd lost count. The insurance company's fraud investigator dropped a bombshell when I called posing as a concerned resident. His voice carried the weary tone of someone who'd seen this pattern before. Ms. Whitmore's operations have generated complaints from 3 previous neighborhoods. We've been building a case for months because insurance fraud affects everyone's premiums. The revelation hit me like cold water. Karen hadn't just done this before. She was a career criminal who'd perfected her methods across multiple states, leaving dozens of traumatized families in her wake. Our neighborhood was just her latest hunting ground. But the most beautiful discovery was Karen's complete vulnerability. Her real estate license expired in 60 days, with renewal under ethics review. The IRS audit Maya had triggered would automatically cascade into state tax investigation. Federal charges carried 10 to 15 years in prison with complete asset forfeiture. Every dollar she'd stolen, every property she'd bought with fraud proceeds, every asset she'd hidden, all of it subject to federal seizure. The insurance trap was elegant in its simplicity. The 5 targeted families could file simultaneous harassment claims, legal fees, emotional distress, property damage, all covered under the original policy terms. The insurance company would pay immediately, then pursue Karen personally for fraud recovery, freezing her assets while federal prosecutors prepared criminal charges. Karen's criminal empire was about to collapse from multiple directions simultaneously. Federal investigation, state licensing board, IRS audit, insurance fraud lawsuit, and civil damages from terrorized families. Her judicial protection would evaporate when Judge Whitmore faced his own ethics investigation for conflicts of interest. The smell of my father's morning coffee drifted from the guest house as I organized the evidence that would destroy Karen's operation. She'd handcuffed a Purple Heart recipient over her manufactured lies, thinking her small-town corruption made her untouchable. Karen was about to discover that federal justice doesn't care about local politics, and the handcuffs waiting for her would be permanent. But first, I wanted her to commit to her biggest fraud yet, the purchase of Mrs. Bennett's property using stolen HOA money. That transaction would trigger automatic asset forfeiture of everything Karen owned, ensuring she'd lose not just her freedom, but every penny she'd ever stolen. The trap was set. Now we just had to wait for Karen's greed to spring it. Walter's dining room transformed into our war room overnight, and seeing my 72-year-old father's space invaded by federal case files broke something inside me that I didn't know could still break. The mahogany table where we'd shared Thanksgiving dinners for decades now groaned under the weight of 3 laptops, insurance documents, and neighborhood maps marked with red pins showing Karen's systematic targeting. The smell of burnt coffee mixed with the metallic scent of overheating electronics as we worked 18-hour days building the case that would destroy Karen's criminal empire. "This feels like Seoul all over again," Walter muttered, studying surveillance photos while his weathered hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from rage at being handcuffed on his own lawn. Except back then the enemy wore uniforms. Maya arrived from Atlanta with boxes of financial records that painted Karen's crimes in devastating detail. "Devin, look at this pattern," she said, spreading bank statements across Walter's coffee table. "Same exact methodology in 4 states over 5 years. She's not just a criminal, she's a franchise operation. Our legal strategy required surgical precision. Federal charges would be filed only after Karen committed to purchasing Mrs. Bennett's property with stolen HOA money, catching her literally spending crime proceeds in real time. Maya had coordinated with IRS criminal investigation to freeze Karen's accounts the moment contracts were signed, triggering automatic asset forfeiture that would seize everything she owned: house, business, shell companies, even her precious Lexus. The community coordination was the most delicate part. 5 terrorized families needed to document every harassment incident without alerting Karen to our federal investigation. Mrs. Bennett's hands shook as she signed evidence collection agreements, the memory of her $200 butterfly garden citation still fresh. "My husband planted those flowers before he died," she whispered, tears mixing with the afternoon sunlight streaming through Walter's windows. Karen called them weeds. Jessica Martinez broke down completely when we explained the scope of Karen's fraud. You mean other families went through this too? Other kids watched their parents get threatened over playground toys? The single mother's anguish filled Walter's living room like smoke, making all of us remember why this case mattered beyond federal statistics. Cole's surveillance equipment turned our guest bedroom into a monitoring station that would have impressed any federal task force. Karen's getting sloppy, he reported, headphones around his neck while audio recordings played Karen's increasingly desperate phone calls. She knows someone's investigating, but greed is overriding caution. Classic criminal psychology. The insurance trap was already springing with mechanical precision. Claims totaling $53,000 had been filed for harassment damages, and the insurance investigator, a former FBI agent named Patterson, recognized federal case indicators immediately. Insurance fraud affects everyone's premiums, he told me during a conference call that echoed through Walter's kitchen. We prosecute these cases more aggressively than most criminal violations. Jessica's sister Maria became our media coordinator, quietly building an investigative series that would expose Karen's multi-state operation. I've interviewed 7 families from her previous neighborhoods, Maria reported, while the smell of Walter's evening coffee filled the room with normalcy that felt surreal given the circumstances. Same targeting pattern: elderly, minorities, working-class families who can't afford legal battles. Technical preparation required coordination across multiple federal agencies. Maya prepared asset seizure warrants covering Karen's holdings in 3 states. Cole arranged surveillance on her communications, discovering escape plans to a non-extradition country. I coordinated with local prosecutors to ensure state charges would complement federal prosecution without creating jurisdictional conflicts. The financial warfare was Maya's masterpiece. Karen's leveraged everything against expected profits from this neighborhood, she explained, calculator clicking as she traced money flows. When we seize her assets, she won't just lose criminal proceeds. She'll lose her house, her business, everything. Complete financial destruction. Walter's healing process required community support that reminded me why neighborhoods matter. Mrs. Bennett brought homemade soup daily, the VFW organized solidarity visits, and Mr. Patterson shared stories of his own military service while helping Walter tend his threatened vegetable garden. The sight of elderly veterans supporting each other against Karen's systematic cruelty gave our case emotional weight that transcended legal technicalities. Neighbor networking expanded our intelligence beyond the original 5 families. Social media campaigns taught residents how to verify HOA legitimacy and challenge fraudulent fees. 3 families from Karen's previous operations agreed to testify, providing pattern evidence for RICO charges. The sound of phones ringing constantly with tips and support created a buzz of community resistance that Karen couldn't ignore. The psychological preparation was crucial for our final phase. Karen's arrogance would be her downfall, but we needed her feeling completely secure when making her biggest mistake. Mrs. Bennett agreed to schedule a final decision meeting about selling her house, making Karen believe victory was within reach. She handcuffed me over a vegetable garden, Walter said quietly, studying the evidence wall we'd created in his hallway. Photos, documents, and red string connected Karen's crimes like a federal conspiracy chart. But she made one mistake: she picked the wrong family to terrorize. Federal prosecutors were calling this case a model for nationwide HOA fraud prosecution. But for us, it was personal. Karen had attacked our father, our community, our sense of justice itself. The next handcuffs would be permanent, and this time the whole world would be watching. Karen's desperation became palpable 2 weeks before her real estate license renewal hearing, and watching her unravel through federal surveillance was like witnessing a controlled demolition in slow motion. The first crack appeared when she received notice that her license renewal had been expedited for review by the state ethics board. Karen didn't know that Maya had fed them evidence of her undisclosed dual representation schemes, but her panic was immediate and visible. Cole's surveillance team recorded her making 17 phone calls in one afternoon, pacing her driveway in designer heels that clicked against concrete like a frantic metronome counting down to her destruction. "Someone's investigating my background," she hissed into her phone during a call to her ex-husband, Judge Whitmore. "The ethics board has documents I've never seen before. How is that possible?" But desperation made Karen dangerous, and her next move proved she'd rather destroy evidence than face consequences. She tried to frame Walter for property damage by planting her own broken mailbox pieces around his truck, complete with his fingerprints from when he'd helped repair it weeks earlier. The morning air smelled like rain and fresh mulch as she scattered debris with surgical precision, not knowing that Cole's cameras were capturing every moment of evidence tampering. Her new police report read like fiction written by someone losing their grip on reality. Walter Blackwood vandalized my mailbox with a hammer sometime between midnight and 3 a.m. His aggressive behavior has escalated to property destruction, proving he's a danger to the neighborhood. Officer Martinez arrived with visible exhaustion, clearly tired of Karen's manufactured emergencies. "Ma'am, Mr. Blackwood was at the VFW poker night until 2 a.m. with 12 witnesses, including my own father-in-law. His truck never moved from his driveway." The police found inconsistencies immediately. Fresh brake patterns that didn't match weathering, fingerprints in impossible positions, Karen's own security camera conveniently malfunctioning during the alleged incident. Her lies were becoming sloppy, and federal surveillance captured her growing panic as each fabrication collapsed under basic scrutiny. But the revelation that changed our timeline came through Cole's wiretap authorization. Federal judges don't grant surveillance lightly, but Karen's interstate fraud pattern and judicial corruption angle provided sufficient cause. What we heard made my coffee taste like acid in my mouth. "We need these people gone before they figure out what we're doing," Karen's voice crackled through Cole's speakers as he played the recording in Walter's kitchen. "The federal interest my contact mentioned, it's real. Someone's building a case." Her ex-husband's response revealed the true scope of their conspiracy. "Karen, I've been protecting you for 3 years, but if federal agents are involved, you're on your own. My judicial career isn't worth your real estate schemes." The corruption ran deeper than we'd imagined. Judge Whitmore had been expediting HOA violation cases without proper review, rubber-stamping Karen's fake citations to create legal pressure on targeted families. His confession on tape gave us judicial corruption charges that would dismantle their entire operation. Karen's most desperate move came when she approached City Code Enforcement Officer Tom Rodriguez with a cash bribe. Tom, being the honest public servant he'd always been, immediately reported the attempt and agreed to wear a wire for the follow-up meeting. The smell of nervous sweat mixed with Karen's expensive perfume as she offered $5,000 for false code violations against all 5 targeted families. "I need official backing for these citations," she pleaded, her voice carrying the desperation of someone watching their empire crumble. "These families think they can ignore community standards, but official city violations would force compliance immediately." Tom's recording captured her explicit offer: cash payment for fraudulent government documents. Federal bribery charges carry 20-year sentences, and Karen had just confessed to systematically corrupting public officials to advance her criminal scheme. The community pressure was mounting visibly. Karen's real estate business withered as word spread through professional networks about her aggressive tactics and questionable ethics. 3 major clients canceled listings after learning about the HOA controversy. Her office waiting room, once bustling with potential sellers, sat empty except for dust motes dancing in afternoon sunlight that no longer brought paying customers. But Karen's most catastrophic mistake was her social media meltdown. She created fake accounts to attack Walter's military record, posting lies about his service that sent the veteran community into protective fury. American Legion members, VFW posts, and Marine Corps associations flooded social media with Walter's commendations and service photos, creating a viral wave of support that drew national attention to Karen's harassment campaign. "Fake veteran claims Purple Heart he never earned," read one of Karen's posts, not knowing that Walter's military records were public and easily verified. Within hours, her lies were exposed by dozens of veterans who'd served with Walter, creating a social media firestorm that local news stations couldn't ignore. The surveillance footage of Karen's final week of freedom showed a woman spiraling into complete paranoia. She installed additional security cameras, changed locks twice, and made increasingly frantic calls to lawyers who kept declining her case once they learned about federal investigation involvement. But her biggest error was accelerating the property purchase timeline. Karen pressured Mrs. Bennett and the other families to accept lowball offers within 48 hours, claiming market conditions required immediate decisions. She was so desperate to complete her fraudulent transactions that she ignored basic criminal precautions. Federal prosecutors approved arrest warrants for Karen and 2 co-conspirators. Asset seizure warrants covered her personal residence, business accounts, and shell company properties across 3 states. The State Ethics Board expedited her license revocation based on federal evidence. Karen thought she was racing toward victory, but she was actually sprinting toward federal handcuffs that would end her criminal career permanently. Karen's final week of freedom began with an act so audacious that even federal prosecutors were stunned by her complete abandonment of caution. She arrived at her real estate office at 7:30 a.m. for the meeting with Mrs. Bennett, convinced that victory was finally within her grasp after months of systematic terrorism against our neighborhood. The surveillance footage from Cole's team showed Karen practically bouncing with excitement as she unlocked her office door, the morning sunlight catching the predatory gleam in her eyes. She'd spent the previous evening preparing contracts for Mrs. Bennett's property purchase, using money directly traceable to fraudulent HOA accounts, essentially signing her own federal arrest warrant with expensive ink. Her phone call to Judge Whitmore that morning revealed the depth of their criminal partnership and her complete disconnect from reality. "Everything's falling into place perfectly," she purred into her cell phone while arranging papers on her desk. "After today's signing, we'll have eliminated the biggest problem family and can move on the remaining 4 properties within the month." The federal surveillance captured every word of her confession. 3 years of coordinated fraud, systematic targeting of vulnerable residents, and judicial corruption to expedite fake violations. Karen was so confident in her untouchable status that she explicitly discussed bribery, money laundering, and conspiracy charges while federal agents recorded every syllable. Mrs. Bennett arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, playing her role as defeated elderly victim with Academy Award precision. At 83 years old, she'd survived the Cultural Revolution, immigrated to America with nothing, and built a life through sheer determination. Karen had picked the wrong woman to intimidate. The hidden recording device in her purse captured every moment of Karen's victory celebration. "Mrs. Bennett, I'm so glad you've come to your senses about this sale," Karen gloated, her voice dripping with false sympathy that made my stomach turn when I heard the recording later. "Your property needs significant investment to meet neighborhood standards, and frankly, at your age, maintaining a house this size must be overwhelming." The racism emerged clearly as Karen explained how neighborhood improvements justified the below-market price she was offering. "We're working to attract a better class of residents," she continued, apparently unaware that every word was being recorded for federal prosecutors. "People who understand community values and can contribute to property appreciation." Mrs. Bennett played her part perfectly, signing the purchase contract while Karen endorsed the cashier's check drawn from accounts we'd already traced to stolen HOA fees. The moment that check changed hands, Karen committed multiple federal crimes simultaneously: wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of authority. But Karen's arrogance reached its peak when she began bragging about her systematic approach to neighborhood improvement. The recording captured her detailed explanation of targeting methodology: elderly residents who couldn't afford legal battles, minorities who faced additional discrimination barriers, and working-class families with limited resources to fight prolonged harassment campaigns. "The key is identifying residents who don't fit the desired demographic profile," Karen explained while organizing the signed contracts that would send her to federal prison. "Create enough pressure through legitimate-sounding violations, and they'll eventually accept reasonable offers to escape the stress." Federal agents were positioned in unmarked vehicles surrounding the building as Karen committed her final crimes. Maya sat outside ready to execute asset seizure warrants the moment contracts were signed. Cole coordinated arrest teams at 3 locations: Karen's office, Judge Whitmore's courthouse chambers, and the shell company headquarters in the neighboring county. The net was closing with mechanical precision, but Karen was too intoxicated by her perceived victory to notice the trap springing around her. She actually opened a bottle of champagne to celebrate the contract signing, the cork's pop echoing through her office like a gunshot, announcing the end of her criminal career. "This calls for a toast," she announced, pouring expensive champagne into crystal glasses while federal agents prepared to burst through her door. "To community standards and property values. Sometimes you have to remove undesirable elements to create the neighborhood people deserve, Mrs." Bennett raised her glass with a smile that Karen mistook for gratitude, but was actually anticipation of justice finally being served. "Yes," she replied quietly, "some elements definitely need to be removed from this community." The champagne was still fizzing in their glasses when federal agents entered with arrest warrants. Karen's face transformed from triumphant smugness to complete shock as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The same metallic sound she'd inflicted on Walter, but this time the roles were permanently reversed. "Karen Whitmore, you're under arrest for wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to violate federal civil rights laws, and operation of a criminal enterprise," the lead agent announced while Karen's champagne glass shattered on her office floor, expensive liquid mixing with tears of disbelief. The simultaneous arrests across 3 locations dismantled Karen's entire operation within minutes. Judge Whitmore was handcuffed in his chambers, shell company partners arrested in 2 other states, and all assets frozen pending federal forfeiture proceedings. Karen's reign of terror ended with her demanding a lawyer, while federal agents read charges that carried a potential 15-year sentence. The same woman who'd handcuffed a Purple Heart recipient over a vegetable garden was now facing the permanent handcuffs of federal justice. Mrs. Bennett walked out of that office free, while Karen rode away in a federal transport vehicle that would deliver her to a detention center where designer heels and expensive perfume wouldn't intimidate anyone. The emergency community meeting at Millbrook Elementary's gymnasium drew the largest crowd in our neighborhood's history, and the electricity in the air felt like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. Standing room only didn't begin to describe it. Residents from 3 surrounding neighborhoods packed the bleachers while local news cameras captured every moment of what would become the most dramatic public vindication our small town had ever witnessed. Walter sat in the front row wearing his best suit, the one he'd worn to receive his Purple Heart decades earlier, his weathered hands steady now that justice was finally being served. The smell of industrial floor cleaner mixed with nervous excitement as Mayor Patterson called the meeting to order, her voice echoing off gymnasium walls that had hosted countless basketball games but never anything quite like this. "Before we begin," the mayor announced, her words carrying the weight of official acknowledgement, "the city of Millbrook owes Walter Blackwood a formal apology for the harassment he endured based on false police reports. Mr. Blackwood, your service to our country and our community deserves our deepest respect." The applause thundered through the gymnasium like a standing ovation at a championship game, and I watched my father's eyes fill with tears he'd been holding back since the morning Karen had him handcuffed on our lawn. Mrs. Bennett reached over and squeezed his hand as Police Chief Rodriguez stepped to the microphone with visible emotion. "Walter Blackwood served our nation for 30 years and our community for even longer," Chief Rodriguez's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "The false reports filed against him were not just lies. They were attacks on everything this community stands for. We failed to protect a man who spent his life protecting others." The American Legion presented Walter with a Community Service Award while cameras flashed and the crowd rose to their feet again. The sound of sustained applause mixed with the gymnasium's acoustic echo created a wall of validation that seemed to physically lift the burden of humiliation from Walter's shoulders. But the real drama began when Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Mitchell took the microphone, her federal credentials lending gravity to revelations that left the crowd gasping. "The case against Karen Whitmore and her co-conspirators represents one of the largest HOA fraud schemes ever prosecuted under federal law," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of justice finally being served. The number she revealed made people pull out their phones to record: $2.3 million in fraud across 4 states, 47 victim families, and a criminal conspiracy that reached into the courthouse itself. "Federal RICO statutes allow prosecution of ongoing criminal enterprises," she explained, "with penalties that can include life imprisonment for defendants who use housing discrimination as a business model." When I stepped forward to identify myself as both Walter's daughter and the DEA agent who'd built the federal case, the gymnasium fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of traffic outside. "My father grew vegetables and parked his truck legally," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the microphone. "Karen Whitmore turned those simple acts into federal crimes by manufacturing violations designed to terrorize vulnerable residents." The evidence presentation left the crowd stunned. Federal prosecutors displayed timeline charts showing Karen's systematic targeting across multiple neighborhoods, demographic analysis proving her discrimination patterns, and financial records revealing the scope of her criminal enterprise. "Insurance companies will provide $500,000 in victim compensation," the prosecutor announced, funded entirely by assets forfeited from the criminal conspiracy. Judge Whitmore's downfall drew gasps from residents who'd trusted the judicial system to protect them. "Judicial corruption undermines the foundation of our legal system," Mitchell explained. "Judge Whitmore faces disbarment, criminal charges, and the complete destruction of his legal career for participating in this conspiracy." The community empowerment portion revealed how residents could protect themselves from similar schemes. "State Attorney General offices have authority to investigate HOA fraud," Mitchell announced, "and can provide free legal assistance to victims of housing discrimination disguised as community standards." When the media questions began, Reporters focused on federal resources devoted to what some called a local HOA dispute. I answered with the full weight of federal authority behind my words. This wasn't a neighborhood squabble. This was an interstate criminal conspiracy using housing discrimination to generate millions in illegal profits. Federal law enforcement exists to protect communities from exactly this type of organized crime. The mic drop moment came when Walter approached the podium for his final statement. The gymnasium fell completely silent as this 72-year-old Purple Heart recipient prepared to address the community that had watched him get handcuffed over lies. "I served 30 years protecting this country from enemies abroad," Walter said, his voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained him through decades of service. Turns out the real threat was a HOA president with a clipboard and a chip on her shoulder, who thought she could terrorize American families in their own neighborhoods. The explosion of laughter and applause that followed seemed to shake the building's foundation. Karen's reign of terror, which had begun with manufactured authority and false citations, ended with community laughter at the absurdity of her pretensions to power. Federal justice had transformed neighborhood fear into collective empowerment, and Karen Whitmore's name would forever be associated with the spectacular failure of thinking that small-town corruption could challenge federal law enforcement. 6 months later, the transformation of our neighborhood felt like waking up from a years-long nightmare into brilliant sunshine that seemed to make everything more vivid and alive. Karen received 8 years in federal prison plus $2.3 million in restitution. Her designer heels traded for orange jumpsuit and federal ID number 4782919. Judge Whitmore was disbarred and sentenced to 3 years for judicial corruption, his legal career ending in the same courthouse where he'd rubber-stamped Karen's fraudulent violations. Their shell company partners pleaded guilty across 3 states, and every single victim family received full compensation from forfeited assets that once funded Karen's criminal lifestyle. The most beautiful change happened where Karen's house once stood. The federal government demolished the structure that had housed so much hatred and converted the lot into a community garden that Walter now manages with the patience of someone who understands that growing good things takes time and care. Children from the neighborhood gather every morning to help him tend vegetables that flourish where Karen's toxic presence once poisoned our street. The smell of rich soil and growing tomatoes has replaced the acrid stench of manufactured outrage that once hung over our community like smog. Mrs. Bennett was unanimously elected president of our newly legitimate neighborhood association, which focuses on community support rather than enforcement. Her first initiative was converting Karen's forfeited business assets into the Walter Blackwood Veterans Education Scholarship, providing college funding for military families' children. The first recipients were Mrs. Bennett's grandson and Jessica Martinez's daughter, kids who will grow up knowing that justice eventually finds those who prey on the vulnerable. The federal impact of our case exceeded every expectation. The Department of Justice issued nationwide guidance for investigating HOA fraud schemes, using Devon's investigation as the model for federal prosecution. Congressional hearings examined the need for federal HOA oversight, and 12 states have strengthened laws requiring incorporation transparency that prevents Karen's type of criminal operation. Walter's healing process amazed everyone who witnessed it. The public vindication at that gymnasium meeting seemed to wash away months of humiliation, and community support reminded him why he'd served his country for 3 decades. He still does his 100 push-ups every morning, but now neighborhood kids count along from the garden where they help him plant seeds that will feed families instead of citations that terrorize them. Our family bonds deepened through this shared mission of protecting our community. Maya continues using her IRS expertise to help residents verify HOA legitimacy. Cole provides federal law enforcement perspective on neighborhood security issues. And I've discovered that federal authority is most meaningful when it protects ordinary people from systematic abuse by those who exploit positions of trust. Property values throughout the neighborhood increased as word spread that we'd become a model community for cooperative living, rather than enforcement-based harassment. The local newspaper featured Willowbrook Estates as a comeback neighborhood, where residents proved that standing together defeats any petty tyrant who thinks authority comes from a clipboard rather than community consent. Jessica Martinez's sister Maria won a state journalism award for her investigative series on HOA fraud, and her reporting inspired victims in 17 other states to report similar schemes to federal authorities. Karen's case became the catalyst for dismantling a network of criminal operations that had terrorized hundreds of families across the country. The annual Neighborhood Justice Day celebration we established draws visitors from surrounding communities who want to learn how residents can protect themselves from systematic abuse. Walter cuts the ribbon on Memorial Garden improvements each year, standing in soil that once supported Karen's house of lies but now nourishes food that brings diverse neighbors together around shared tables. Every morning when I hear Walter's coffee kettle whistle from the guest house, I'm reminded that federal law enforcement exists to protect communities like ours from predators who disguise greed as governance. Karen thought her small-town corruption made her untouchable, but she discovered that federal justice reaches everywhere, and the Constitution protects every American's right to plant vegetables and park trucks without facing manufactured harassment from criminals with clipboards. The sweetest victory is watching children play on playground equipment purchased with Karen's forfeited fraud proceeds, their laughter echoing where her threats once poisoned our peaceful street. Justice transformed our neighborhood from fear to fellowship, proving that communities united against systematic abuse can defeat any scheme designed to divide and exploit them. If you've got your own HOA nightmare story, drop it in the comments. Your experience might help someone else fight back against these systematic predators. And make sure to subscribe because next week I'm telling you about the parking meter company that tried to scam our entire downtown until they messed with the wrong family of accountants who turned their own greed against them.